I'm John Knight Lundwall. Welcome to Myth and the Bible. It's been a few weeks. Today we're going to go over how orality and literacy changed the contours of history, how it affected large patterns in the unfolding of history, and then we're going to discuss how that affected religion, including biblical religion. So let's get started. Remember, like, subscribe, share, comment, and have fun. So here we are. Here's our timeline. Again, modern Homo sapiens are at least 100 to 200,000 years old. We have at least from 70,000 BCE and earlier up to 100,000 BCE evidence of art. By 50,000 BCE, there's archaeological evidence for burials, which means there's metaphysics at play. Some belief in an afterlife, maybe a belief in a pre-life, certainly a belief in life, as well as complex hunting techniques. But it's not towards the end of after 1 to 200,000 years, that writing was invented, around 3200 BCE, plus or minus a century or so. What's interesting is that at the same time writing is invented in Mesopotamia, we have the appearance of the city-state, a brand new social structure. Now, certainly in prehistory, going back thousands of years, we have villages and complex villages. We have nomadic travel, and I think that just believing that people followed herds and games and the food supply is probably wrong-headed. There was probably a deep metaphysics at play, a religious cosmovision at play during their nomadic travels. But by 3200 BC, we have a new complexity in the social structure. We have these larger city-states being established, surrounded by walls, anchored by agriculture, by fields, but especially established upon a regimented temple cult priesthood. In Mesopotamia and in Egypt, you could not build a city before you had established a temple. And actually, again, this is a pattern that goes back into prehistory in these, pre-urban, pre-city state peoples. In Europe, you would go and cosmicize the land before you would establish your village. That is, you would set up a stone, a standing stone, a stone ring, an altar, or a tree even. And that would be your sacred center, your axis mundi, around which the village would be built. Well, by 3200 BC, we now have the establishment of temples, temple cults, temple priesthoods, who are managing not just the religion, but the state. And we have larger cities, larger populations, all being managed politically, economically, agriculturally, religiously, through a royalty and a temple priesthood. So the question is, does writing precipitate this? Does it arise with it as a necessary component of the rise of the city-state? And it appears that it does. It appears that the more complex your social systems are, you need a way to manage it. And when your village is 100 people or less, your nomadic tribe is 100 people or less, writing really isn't necessary. Well, when you have 10, 20, 30,000 people, you need a way to manage that. And sure enough, most of the early writing are management kinds of texts, receipts, contracts, records of market transactions, the kind of stuff you would need in order to manage multiple complex social relations. So in any case, the rise of writing also comes with it the rise of the city-state. Well, it takes several centuries for there to be not only a regimented temple priestly caste, but now a regimented scribal caste with regimented rules and processes for writing, tablets, papyri. Again, these early societies, their vocabularies are tens of thousands of words long, 10, 20,000 words. Your alphabets are logographic, and they have scores of symbols, sometimes hundreds of symbols. There's a lot of punning that goes on with your words and your vocabulary. It's a full-time job to learn writing. But by 2500 BCE, we now have an established core of literate scribes in every city, and the city is run by them. And by by the 24th century BCE, we have finally the emergence of empire. Our first empires, which is now not only a much more complex city-state housing tens of thousands of people, but now an empire where a king is now ruling 10, 12, 20 city-states. It is impossible to imagine that kind of social structure without writing. And so the birth of writing comes with a birth of social complexity that allows for empire building as well as modern civilization upon which that is based. So there's something else that's happening at this time, though, and that is there's new massive structures that are being built. The Great Pyramid, for example, the ziggurats and massive temple complexes in Mesopotamia. To build something like the Great Pyramid requires enormous amount of materials, labor, food, trade, transport, payment of some sort. There's economic transactions. How do you do all of that? Let alone the engineering. How do you do all of that without writing? And I don't think you do. I think definitely writing, since its invention, not only helps increase the social complexity of society, but it also helps increase the scientific and architectural complexities of society. And certainly, it establishes a new kind of science called astrology. We'll talk about this in future lectures, but the astrological worldview, again, probably goes back well into prehistory, but as a codified system of tracking all the celestial movements and giving them meaning, that develops with writing. And so writing wed to oral cosmology equals astrology. And the astrological worldview dominated the human species all the way up until the scientific revolution a few centuries ago. Well, something happens. Here we are, 1200 BCE. Something happens in history that is still a great mystery in history. There's a book by Eric Klein, 1177, The Year Civilization Collapsed. And basically, that's what happened in the 12th century BCE. Civilization collapsed. What we get is a major retraction of all the borders and influence of the major empires in the ancient world. The Minoan civilization disappears. The Egyptian civilization retracts back to the Nile Delta and within the confines of the Nile. The Hittites and Near Eastern civilization all retract. This seems to correspond. In Egypt, there's an invasion of the Sea Peoples, and it's actually a brutal mess. And Egypt repels them, but it diminishes their power for centuries. And so, is invasion the only thing causing a series of dominoes to happen with these major civilizations disappearing or retracting? And of course, Eric Klein's argument is that can't be the only thing. There's a sort of perfect historical storm that occurs. Climate change, famine, war, invasion. These begin creating tipping points, and sure enough, the tipping points tip. And so what we get is this really interesting period where you get these major retractions of society, and this just so happens to be the emergence of the Israelite people, right? And this, Moses, we don't know the dating. We'll talk about that in a sec. Around 12 to 1300 BCE, plus or minus this century or so. But the Israelites certainly established themselves in the Levant during this time where the major empires are experiencing this kind of social retraction. So this gives a new people a foothold in order to build a new kingdom. Something else is happening, though, starting around 1200 BCE. The German historian Karl Jaspers calls this the mark of the axial age. Axial as in everything is turning on an axle. History is a wheel, and it begins turning at about this time. And really, by the middle of the first millennium BCE, by 600 BCE, you can look back in history and say, oh my goodness, everything did turn. Everything did change. And of course, it took centuries to happen. But what is happening? Well, what happens is not only are there major retractions with civilization, but the religious structures of the civilizations also begin changing. And we see this process, such as in India, the Vedas are a very orthopraxic, cosmological system of gods and religion. You perform your sacrifices. Every god is associated with the star, sun, moon. Your religious rites are cosmological in nature, and they're communal. You gather together, and everything's run by the cult. Well, this is established, before the city-state, but this is what's been going on since the city-state. But, by 600 BC, we've got brand new religions. In fact, by 600 BC, we've got the development of Buddhism, Jainism, Zoroastrianism. We have Taoism in China and Confucius in China. We have major reforms in Israel with Isaiah and Jeremiah. And all of these new religious structures have some commonalities. They emphasize the individual over the group, the individual relationship with the divine over the individual relationship with the city-state. Now, that is still there, and it will be there for centuries. But with Buddhism, for example, you are literally trying to escape the wheel of rebirth by obtaining individual enlightenment. Buddha means to awaken, and technically you don't worship Buddha, but you are to become a Buddha through individual enlightenment. You are literally trying to find a way to leave the culture of the city-state and to arise into a new awakened being. Well, there is this emphasis of again, the reforms of Isaiah and Jeremiah are largely political in that the religion should be separated from the politics of the city-state, and people should just live their covenant with Yahweh independent of what's going on politically. This was such a unpopular view, by the way, that they murdered Jeremiah for saying it. But so we get this transition that will culminate in Christianity, for Christ is the quintessential personal deity of salvation. But this process begins happening from about 1200 BCE forward. And it just so happens that at this same time, we get a new innovation in our communication systems. The medium is the message. And inasmuch as the invention of writing transformed civilization with the rise of the city-state, this new innovation in writing is a new alphabet. It's a phonetic. Start getting phonetic alphabets. Phoenician and Greek are not only phonetic, symbols represent sounds as opposed to whole words or concepts in our earlier logographic alphabets. But our earlier alphabets, generally, when the word did represent sounds, represented only the consonants. These new alphabets have vowel representations, and they're reductive. Instead of scores or hundreds of characters that you have to memorize, and have, punning relationships. There's less than 30 characters to memorize. You're memorizing only sounds, and as a result, it's quite easy to, much easier anyway, to learn writing, to learn literacy. But also, because the symbols now represent sounds and not concepts, words, or pictures of things that you see in nature, over time, again, writing becomes separated from the things you observe. And so when you read the symbols on a page, you begin thinking analytically. You're thinking only about the symbols and not, the referent they refer to in nature. The symbols form words, and you start thinking of words as opposed to the actual object in nature that you used to think of. When this happens, there is, a couple of things happen. Vocabulary start increasing. You can start playing with ideas on a page much easier than you do with objects in nature. And so your vocabulary start increasing, your analytical thought structures start increasing, and this is certainly what helps drive innovations in the religious structure. But because before, the religious structure was to maintain the community of the city-state and the social structure. Right? Now religion is going to focus on individual enlightenment. And we can do this because now we can reflect deeply using literacy to do this. Literally, this kind of religiosity is a birth of literacy. It coincides with innovations in writing. All right, so by 400 BCE, not only do we have these new religious structures, but by 400 BCE, we have Greek science. So we can now think analytically sufficiently enough that, we get the Greek classical Renaissance, right? Sort of the ancient scientific revolution, where we start reading Greek texts, and they're now sounding non-mythological, but very modern in that people are working out precepts and concepts as to how nature works. So look, please know this was going on before the Greeks. This was going on in oral societies, but it was going on with different oral cognitive structure that again served the community, that was very concrete, that was analogical and not analytical. And so a lot of historians of science begin the story of modern science in classical Greece. And I think this is problematic because there is definitely science at work in building the Great Pyramid and these ziggurats. There's astronomy involved, there's physics involved, there's engineering involved. There's also a deep philosophy and metaphysics involved. But they are attached to mythological constructs, which means they're attached to oral constructs, right? And so, but by 400 BCE, we have the development of our early Greek, and Greek science is not modern science by any means. Aristotelian science is not modern science. They haven't developed the modern scientific method. But by also 400 BCE, we have the writing of the Torah. And so not only is science being transferred into literate writing concepts, so is religion. The Torah is a thunderclap on the historical horizon because it really is transferring the cult and the entire religious experience into a text. And so, this is new. And while there are religious texts, we have to remember that before this time, the religious texts were the subtext to the rituals. They were secondary. The Torah now becomes primary in the religious experience of Jewish life. By 200 BCE, we have the invention of the codex, and this is simply cutting up scrolls and binding them in books. And this gives us really the foundations for our first world religion that begins completely and totally using text. It's a literate religion, and this is, of course, Christianity. Here we are, and this graph is simply rates of literacy through history. We have over here the far left primary orality, where there is no writing, of course 0% literacy. Then the invention of writing around 3200 BCE, and it takes about 3,000 years for 2,600 2,800 years for this fully literate consciousness that we get in Greece, for example, to develop. But in any case, all through the ancient world, you had about 5% of the population. This is just your scribal, priestly, royal class that can read and write. And they're, again, using writing to manage the state. It's still very concrete, still very connected to oral practices. But then when we get this phonetic reductive alphabets, we start seeing a change by the middle of the first millennium BCE. I mean, Greece even establishes by the 4th century BCE public schools, and by that I mean mostly just a few boys could go, but there was a system, now a social system for education, teaching letters, and certainly by the Roman period, the late Roman period, with the codex, we now have print culture. It's still very expensive, but by early Greek times, only in urban areas, I should say, in the countryside, you still have less than 5% of the people, always less than 5% that can read or write. But in urban areas, we start getting bigger numbers. 10% of the society can read or write. By the Roman era, in urban areas, we have 20% of the population. Well, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a tipping point. When you have 20% of your population literate, basically the entire society is being run by literacy, by writing. This process has been going on for a long time, but all your government, all your trade, everything now is contractual and being written down. Of course, it's not till the printing press, 15th century CE, that we start getting major leaps in the increase in literacy. And then with the university system, it takes a century or two, but you start getting most of the population literate. Well, now we're going to apply this, this kind of literacy and how it developed with the rise of civilization, empire, the transformation of religion, to a biblical timeline. And of course, we should just say everything, the biblical timeline is not set in stone. Everything before 1000 BCE, there's almost no archaeological evidence for. We've got a potsherd with the name of Moshe on it, a couple names of David, but that doesn't verify much, if anything. So it's only in the first millennium BCE that we can really start lining up the Bible with archaeological evidence. But anyway, according to the biblical record, we have the patriarchs. This is Enoch and Noah and Methuselah and Lamech before 2200 BCE. They're living in a world that's either fully oral because they're nomadic, so they're not in the urban areas. 1800 BCE is the standard dating for Abraham. He does come from Ur, which is a city-state. There is literacy there. Again, 5% of the people. Was he literate? A lot of scholars don't even believe he was historical. We'll talk about that in the future. I don't know why we have to get rid of people historically if they live in a mythologic age. That's not how it works. So was he literate? He could be. Being illiterate is a pejorative. Really, we should call them pre-literate. But in any case, it doesn't matter. The kind of religion Abraham is practicing is this oral cult of sacrifices and cosmology. This is the kind of religion that exists in the Mesopotamia and the Near East and Egypt. It's not textual religion. So we have definitely, 1300 BCE, Moses, plus or minus a few centuries. Moses is a prince of Egypt, according to the text. He would definitely be literate. But he's not writing what Herodotus writes, full historical stories. The tradition of the Torah is that Moses writes the Torah, but if you read the Torah, there's nothing in the second millennium BCE that's being written like the Torah. Nothing that we've found. And so clearly the Torah, the writings of the Pentateuch, are being written by literate scribes centuries after Moses. But that doesn't mean there isn't a literate tradition surrounding Moses, a Mosaic tradition of writing of some sort of scrolls or tablets. What that might look like, well, we just don't know. But again, doesn't matter. We're still dealing with this oral cult, the temple cult. Israelite temple cult is the form of religiosity in the ancient world and in biblical history for most of it. It's very important to note because most Jews and Christians read the Bible as a literate religion, whereas most of the Bible is an oral cultic religion. By 1000 BCE, we do have, the kingdom of Israel established with King David. This is our first Israelite urbanization, standardization, and we start getting segmental alphabets, which are, have phonemes. The signs represent phonemes. This gets technical, and we won't get into it, but they're phonemes with modifiers. Logographic alphabets are pictures that represent words or concepts. They do have phonetic elements in them. Segmental alphabets will have like a phoneme of an S that makes a word plural, for example, right? So there's modifiers to words and phonetic elements to the words. A lot of these alphabets are just have the consonants in them, and there's still a ton of punning going on. But we do get King David and King Solomon who are urbanizing and standardizing the writing, the city-state, the priesthood cult. This is all being run by the literate priestly caste. By 700 BCE, we do have Isaiah, and Isaiah does represent a large literary tradition. So we know that, again, Isaiah doesn't write all of Isaiah. It represents a literary tradition that is Isaic in nature. There's multiple scribes that contribute to the Isaic tradition, but by 700 BCE, we have a literary caste of prophets and scribes running the religion of Israel. And that probably tells us that by that time, there had been traditions that is recorded in the Torah that had been written down. But then we have this, we also have phonetic alphabets, fully phonetic. The Hebrew is phonetic and reductive. There's not a lot of characters that you have to memorize in order to learn it. And so this, again, impels a change in the way religion is practiced. By 587 BCE, this is the linchpin. Their temple cult gets destroyed. Jerusalem is sacked by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and the heart of their religious structure is annihilated. Hundreds of thousands of Jews are killed, and most others are sent to Babylon as slaves. They're there for 70 years before Cyrus returns them, and they start coming back. When they do come back, they are being led by fully literate scribes, Ezra and Nehemiah. Around 400 BCE is when they transfer their religion from the temple cult into a text, the Torah. And this, it changes everything. While we're at this point, let's just note that I make a difference between Israelites and Jews. For me, the Israelites is the oral religion. This would be the patriarchs all the way down, all the way down to the destruction of the temple. Even though there's, literacy going on in a deep literate tradition around the Isaiah tradition, the religion is still largely cultic, based in the temple, operated by the temple priests, communal with sacrifices. So when I say Israelite religion, really we're talking about a kind of religiosity. It's the oral cult. This gets transferred by the time the Torah is written into a literate religious text that you read and reflect on. And you engage with the divine through meditation through a text. Yeah, that wasn't happening with the Israelites. That starts happening with the Jews. And so I make this demarcation that after the destruction of the temple and the writing of the Torah, we have a new kind of religiosity. I will call that Judaism. The old kind of religiosity, I will call that Israelites. And the Israelites were oral cultic religion. Jews are literate religion based around the Torah, highly individualized and philosophical. Just so we finish off the biblical timeline using our literate kind of template, we do have full literacy by 400 BC. There's a great assembly where the Torah, according to tradition, is put together. By 200 BCE, the destruction of the temple has happened, and ultimately they've not only replaced the oral cult with a written text, the Torah, they replaced the temple with a scholastic organization called the synagogue. This is a new kind of social structure where Jews gather to discuss the Torah, right? I mean, there's still religious rituals going on. There's still animal sacrifices going on. But this is a new layer that has been put in, and eventually it's the layer that is kept while everything else gets dropped. And so the synagogue becomes a new religious scholastic structure where literacy is taught, where the Torah is argued and discussed and read. We also get the Greek translation of the Hebrew Tanakh at this time. We have the Essenes. It's very important. This is where our Dead Sea Scrolls come from, and they are still very orthopraxic. They have cultic things going on, but at the same time, they're highly literate, and they're recording everything. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have all kinds of texts. And so we have this synthesis here with the Essenes. By 70 CE, there's this thing called the Council of Jamnia. Now, traditionally, it was said that this is where Jewish rabbis got together and codified the Tanakh, what the Christians call the Old Testament, with all the books. Now, this view has been deconstructed in the past couple decades. But I put it here simply because by the 1st century CE, one thing has happened. Religion is being managed by texts. And people are arguing over which texts are canonical, which are better than others, right? Who's written them? Who's the authority? And certainly Christianity starts this way. Again, we have the Gospels, which are largely oral tells. Jesus teaches almost exclusively in parables, in oral mediums. He's telling oral stories to people who do not read or write. But the religion itself is being established on texts. And again, there's no grand oral priesthood cult that we know of that's going on. Christianity begins by the recording of the life of Jesus in a text. And now religion is going to refer to the life of Jesus. And this translates into a sort of historicity that is now part of truth, or essential part of truth. The scriptural text is historical, referring to a historical person, and the text itself is how we access the historical person and the divine. By 400 CE, we do get the canonization of the New Testament. Just to save time, I've got to speed through this. By 1000 CE, we have manuscript culture. And by the way, this is the time that we know for certain that the Hebrew Old Testament or Tanakh is standardized. Between the 7th and 11th century CE, this process had been going on. But by 1000 CE, we have the Masoretic text, which is official canonized version of the Old Testament. But something else has happened along this way. By 1000 CE, there is a scribal culture that has made sure that there are rules for copying texts. This took centuries to develop, but by 1000 CE, we now get things in our scrolls and in our codices, our books, such as tables of contents and page numbering and verses and paragraphs. We get the formatting of text. Before it was just there were some illustrations, but it was just text, right? But there are also rules set in place that scribes had to follow in order to copy a text. And this became very regimented, very rule-based, with lots of people overseeing it, because they wanted to create, they knew errors slipped in, and they wanted to create a perfect copy of a previous text. And actually, this starts getting people thinking about a perfect text. And over a couple centuries, people begin thinking the Bible needs to be a perfect text, and they start assuming inerrancy in the text. That this comes with this kind of standardization. And so now, amongst Protestant fundamentalists, there is assumed that the Bible is inerrant. Well, this actually is part of a historical process that begins with the standardization of dealing with copying texts. And we start getting this idea of inerrancy with scribes who are trying to copy the text inerrantly, right? Finally, at 1500 CE, we have the Protestant Reformation, the invention of the printing press. The Protestants are the first people to use the printing press for massive, for propaganda. And Protestant spreads largely through the help of print, through flyers and newspapers and the spread of the word of departing from the Catholic Church. And so, but it's also a time where, new Bibles can now be made and printed, and Bibles are no longer being copied in Latin, but now in English and in German, and now people who are wealthy enough can buy their own Bible. It doesn't have to be read to them by a priest, a literate priest. And again, this just changes the entire fabric of religion, where religion is less and less communal. It used to be the temple cult, then it was the synagogue, then it's the priest reading the text from the pulpit, and now it's a Bible in your own living room that you can access the divine with. This is the kind of religion that we're familiar with today, and we forget that took centuries to develop. Well, just reviewing this idea of the Word. And again, when we hear the Word, we think of the written Word. But for most of history, the sacred, the divine, was not the written Word. But, before 600 BCE, which is the apex of our axial age, the Word was ritual. You performed the Word. You didn't read the Word. You performed it in ritual in the temple cult. By 400 BCE, the Israelites turned the Word into the Torah. The Word is Torah. And now the Word is a collection of writings. This is radically different. By 0 CE, the Christians make a new radical innovation. The Word is now flesh. It's no longer a ritual tradition or a written tradition based off the ritual tradition. It is God himself becoming flesh. And now our religion is simply going to be reflexive writing about that experience. No sacrifices need to be had. No rituals, no temple cult. Still we can argue there was rituals and a sort of cultic structure in early Christianity. Margaret Barker makes excellent arguments along this line. But it doesn't matter. This is a new vibration of religion that has emerged and that will continue to develop. Certainly by 400 CE, the word is canonized. We now have a specific Christian text that is authoritative. By 1000 CE, as I said, the word becomes inerrant as they seek inerrant ways to copy the text. By 1500 CE, with the Protestant Reformation, the word is historical. It's interesting that after the Protestant Reformation, the invention of the printing press, people have forgotten at this point the oral cultic tradition. It's just forgotten. And so now the Bible is looked at as a historical record. This is largely a Protestant phenomenon as they go out and they start reading the Bible as what literally happened in world history. By 1000 CE, this idea of the word as inerrant develops. By 1500 CE, it's not only inerrant, it's completely historical. By 1800 CE, in the United States of America, we have these religious movements called the Great Awakening. There's a couple Great Awakenings. This is where we start seeing things like Protestant fundamentalism, where the word is not only inerrant and historical, but it's now interpreted as very literal. And, there really was a Noah, and he really did build a boat that was slightly larger than a football field, and he really did put 2 of every animal on it, with all the fresh water and hay and food that you would need for 2 of every animal on a boat that size. They're reading it very literally. And, this is the birth of creationism, where science is being infused into the biblical text, which is now inerrant, historical, and literal. And then, of course, today, by 2000 CE, we live in a postmodern world where, we still have the fundamentalists with that paradigm, but a lot of other Christian sects, the word is relative. It's all whatever, it's your truth. And so, just so I put this table here so you can see the evolution of how people approach the Bible or biblical religion. From the earliest day, it was ritual, then it became Torah, then it became a written tradition about Jesus, then it became canonized, then it became inerrant, then it became... This didn't all happen at once, and we sometimes assume that this is the way it was at the beginning. No, it took centuries for us to have our biblical sensibilities, and this is sort of the outline as to how that happened. So in the end, here we are. What is the word? And this question ultimately is attached to our ideas of the sacred, of the holy, of God. What is God? What is the sacred? What is truth? What is reality? What is the path to know these things? Who are the guides of the way? My previous chart was to show you that through history, these questions actually never change. The questions are always the same. They're called the terrible questions, the existential questions of human meaning. There they are, and people are always asking them. However, the answers to them do change. The methods that we use to ask and answer them change. The medium is the message. And as those methods change, our understanding of God and the sacred change. And so religion is a historical evolution of change.